This is the Title IV Part A, Subpart 1, Student Support and Academic Enrichment, LEA Statewide Random Validation Training. The Random Validation Training will only request documentation for selected Title IV Part A requirements in the current year. However, a district must ensure it has documentation on file for all Title IV Part A program requirements. The presentation will provide a brief overview of the program purpose and the consultation requirements that will be validated. This presentation is intended solely to provide general information and guidance to Texas ESCs, LEAs, and participating private schools, and reflects the Texas Education Agency's current understanding of statute and applicable federal guidance. The content of this presentation is subject to change as a result of further potential information and guidance provided by federal agencies with regulatory oversight of these programs. This presentation does not constitute legal advice, and entities are therefore advised to seek legal counsel regarding the information and guidance provided before acting on such information. Documenting overall compliance for a program requirement may require several forms of documentation to be maintained locally and available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. Also remember, to ensure overall compliance with program requirements, LEAs should refer to the program guide and/or other program-related resources that reference the multiple forms of documentation required to be maintained locally. The documentation requested for submission during the random validation process may not include all forms of documentation that are required to be maintained locally. I want to share a reminder regarding the Title IV Part A program's intent and purpose. First, this program is designed to provide all students with access to a well-rounded education. Second, to improve school conditions for a safe and healthy student learning environment. And third, improve technology for the enhancement of academic outcomes and digital literacy of all students. The random validation items are aligned with the Title IV Part A program intent and purpose. The LEA random validation items are aligned to other TEA documents. The Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA statutory requirement, the ESSA program-specific provisions and assurances, the random validation item being selected, and the compliance report program compliance self-check items. Randomly selected LEAs will be notified on October 9th for Title IV Part A validation. Districts supporting documentation to the selected Title IV Part A requirement must be submitted through the TEA Federal Program Compliance Division's Work app within 2 weeks, which is October 23rd. The Title IV Part A random validation timeline is posted. You may see each task and the due date for each of the tasks by LEA, ESC staff, as well as the TEA program staff. The standard meeting documentation that an LEA should maintain locally includes meeting agendas, meeting notes or minutes, and sign-in sheets. Please note that documentation for virtual meetings is an acceptable form of documentation. Participant rosters that include the meeting title, meeting date, and names, and roles will be acceptable substitutes for the more traditional sign-in sheets. This eliminates the need of a participant's written signature. Please refer to the table referenced on this slide to determine what is required on meeting documentation and what is considered best practice. The meeting documentation should include the meeting title, campus name, location, date, the time, the stakeholder names, and the roles in which they are representing. Parents may not be district employees in order to fill the parent roles on the committee. As stated earlier, the LEA random validation items are aligned to TEA documents. Throughout the handbook, the LEA is guided through the alignment with TEA documents and provided requirements for submitting applicable documentation to meet the requirement. The random validation this year for Title IV Part A will focus on consultation and inclusion of the required stakeholders to determine how funds are spent on applicable programs and activities. Title IV Part A statute provides specific guidance on the required ongoing consultation and stakeholders. The district must provide evidence that consultation occurred and included all Title IV Part A required stakeholders, including parents, teachers, principals, and other school leaders, students, community-based organizations, government officials, and more. Title IV Part A statute defines government officials as local law enforcement, local juvenile court, local child welfare agency staff, or a local public housing agency. Where applicable, districts should also include Indian tribes, charter school staff, and others with expertise in programs and activities designed to meet the purposes of Title IV Part A. For the school year, the Title IV Part A random validation will focus on timely and meaningful consultation with the required stakeholders. The input of required stakeholders, focus groups, advisory committees, and district improvement teams is the LEA's requirement for the indicator. There are two forms of acceptable documentation an LEA must submit. First, agendas of stakeholder groups, focus groups, advisory committees, and district improvement teams that include identified roles of all Title IV Part A required stakeholders, according to the Title IV Part A statute. And secondly, sign-in sheets which must include identified roles of meeting participants. Participant rosters must include the meeting title, meeting date, and stakeholder names and their roles would be acceptable substitutes for the more traditional sign-in sheets. This eliminates the need of a participant written signature when using a virtual meeting environment. So if an LEA conducted consultation meetings through Zoom or other virtual platforms, it may submit electronic documentation of participant attendance and information. Throughout the year, the district must continue in consultation with required stakeholders and ensure that their focus is on improving local activities, meeting the intent and purposes of the Title IV Part A program, and coordinating and collaborating program implementation with other community strategies, programs, and activities. Assurances related to Title IV Part A. The LEA will engage in meaningful and continued consultation with the broad range of stakeholders, including but not limited to parents, teachers, principals, school leaders, specialized instructional support personnel, students, community-based organizations, local government representatives, Indian tribes or tribal organizations, when applicable, charter school leaders if the agency or consortium supports charter schools, and others with relevant and demonstrated expertise in programs and activities designed to meet the purpose of this program. If applicable, include documentation stating that any Title IV Part A required stakeholder roles that are not located within district boundaries for participation. Otherwise, the district should submit documentation to include all of the required stakeholders, A through K, on the slides. To ensure overall compliance with program requirements, LEAs should refer to the program guide and/or other program-related resources that reference the multiple forms of documentation required to be maintained locally. The documentation requested for submission during the random validation process may not include all forms of documentation that are required to be maintained locally. On the compliance report, one of the LEA program compliance self-check items asks for the LEA to be engaged in timely and meaningful consultation with a broad range of stakeholders as part of their process in determining the targeted areas of improvement related to students' access to effective programs. Within that compliance report, the LEA indicates yes or no if it has ensured documentation is readily available and kept locally if requested by TEA for auditing purposes. The dated agendas and/or meeting notes and the participant rosters and sign-in sheets of stakeholder consultation meetings with all Title IV Part A required stakeholders and their roles must be identified in the documentation. Please include the following selected documentation in order to demonstrate compliance with the program requirement described: agendas and/or ongoing meeting notes of stakeholder sessions, focus groups, advisory committees, and/or district improvement team meetings, and participant rosters or sign-in sheets of stakeholder consultation meetings. The documentation must include all Title IV Part A required stakeholders and each identified role. If applicable, include documentation stating any Title IV Part A required stakeholder roles that are not located within the district boundaries for participation. The district has identified that on documentation and submitted. Issues that may result in an improvement needed status are auditable documentation requested was not submitted, documentation submitted does not reference all the required Title IV Part A stakeholders and identified roles located within district boundaries, documentation submitted does not list stakeholders that are not located within district boundaries for participation, documentation submitted does not align to the requested consultation documentation that is required, and the documentation from a prior year was submitted instead of a current year's documentation. These are just samples of some of the issues that could result in improvement status. Thank you for attending this session. If there are questions following this presentation, feel free to reach out to me, Lenitra Guest, the Title IV Part A Program Director. On the slide, you see my personal email address and my desk number. You may also reach out to the ESSA Support Division email address or call the division phone number. Thank you and have a wonderful day.